When I was 15, my parents took me and my best friend Landon Reyes on a camping trip to Maple Hollow State Park in upstate New York. It was supposed to be one last adventure before sophomore year, one last breath of summer air before homework, hallways, and cafeteria meatloaf took over again. The kind of trip that was more about campfires and marshmallows than anything genuinely wild. Maple Hollow stretched for miles. Dense forests of oak and birch, pine needles thick on the ground, and hiking trails that wove through the landscape like veins through a body. There was something ancient about the place. The air smelled heavy with damp bark and moss. It was beautiful, sure, but even that first afternoon, something about it made me feel like we didn't quite belong. We set up camp near Lake Briar, a small but deep body of water framed by tall trees that creaked softly in the wind. My parents parked the SUV alongside a line of other cars and started unloading the tent gear, while Landon and I darted off to explore. We weren't supposed to go too far, but we were 15, old enough to pretend we knew what we were doing, and young enough to still get nervous when the woods got too quiet. That night, after hot dogs and s'mores, we sat around the fire, telling stories we'd heard from older kids back home. Ghosts in mirrors, hitchhikers who disappeared, campers who went missing and were never found, the usual stuff. Landon, always the braver one, dared me to join him on a night hike. Just a short walk, just to feel the thrill of the woods after dark. We waited until my parents were tucked in their sleeping bags before we slipped away, flashlights in hand, following the pine bough trail as it snaked around the lake and into the thicker part of the forest. At first it was exciting. The trees looked bigger under the moonlight, like giants huddled together in secret. We joked about skinwalkers and bear attacks, our laughter echoing just a little too loudly in the still air. Then we heard it. At first it was nothing, just a rustle in the underbrush, a crunch of leaves. Probably a deer, we said, maybe a raccoon. But then we heard the voice, low, raspy, muttering something that didn't sound quite right. We stopped cold. I swept my flashlight across the trees, but all I saw were trunks and brambles. Landon raised his hand, signaling me to be quiet. The muttering continued, rhythmic and broken like someone reciting a prayer in reverse. And then we saw her. She was crawling across the path on all fours, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie and black pants, both stained with dirt. Her hair was matted, clumps of it stuck to the side of her face like seaweed. She moved slowly, knees dragging through the leaves, whispering something over and over again. I couldn't make out the words. We froze. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my feet felt anchored to the trail. She stopped, sensing us maybe, and turned her head slowly. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. For a second we just stood there, paralyzed. Then Landon whispered, "Should we help her?" It felt like the wrong question, but I nodded anyway. We stepped forward cautiously, calling out to her. She blinked, tried to stand, wobbled, then collapsed back to her knees. She said something about looking for her tent, about losing her friends, but the words were slurred and confused. Drunk, maybe, or high, or worse. Between us, we each took an arm and helped her up. She leaned heavily against us as we led her back down the trail. Eventually we found her site near the far edge of the lake, barely a campsite at all. Her tent was half collapsed, gear scattered around like it had been dumped from the sky. No sign of anyone else. She mumbled something about Sarah, or maybe Sandra, someone she was looking for. We gave her our extra bottle of water and helped her sit down. She kept rocking back and forth, whispering to herself. We told her we'd go get help, but she didn't respond. We didn't go back. Instead, we ran straight to our own campsite and zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags without telling a word to my parents. The next morning, we saw her again. She was sitting alone at a picnic table near the lake, staring out at the water. Her posture was stiff, her eyes looked hollow and red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept in days. Landon waved. She didn't even blink. When my mom asked what we were staring at, we just said we'd seen a drunk camper the night before. We didn't mention the crawling, or the whispers, or the cold, empty way she'd looked at us. We wanted to believe it was over, that it was a strange encounter with someone who'd had too much to drink and wandered away from her friend. But deep down, we both knew something was wrong. Something about her didn't feel human anymore. That evening, after a long family hike up Juniper Ridge, we decided to go on another walk, just a short one before dark, maybe to prove to ourselves that it had all been in our heads. We stayed near the main trail, laughing nervously, pretending we weren't looking for her. But then we heard it again. A voice, whispering. We stopped. There she was, standing beneath a crooked tree about 20 feet off the trail, her arms limp at her sides, her head tilted slightly as she spoke to no one. Her voice was low but fast, like she was trying to explain something to an invisible person. We thought she might have been on a phone call, but there was no phone. When she noticed us, she stopped talking. Her body went still, her face locked in a look I could only describe as hunted. Landon grabbed my arm. Let's go. We didn't run, but we didn't look back either. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard rustling outside our tent. Footsteps. Light, slow, moving from one side to the other. My parents were still asleep, snoring softly in the other tent. I nudged Landon awake, and his eyes snapped open. He'd heard it too. We held our breath as something scraped gently across the side of our tent. A zipper? Fingers? I couldn't move. Eventually the sound stopped. At dawn, without saying a word, we packed our things. When I told my parents we wanted to leave a day early, they didn't argue. Maybe they saw it in our faces, that wide-eyed fear you can't fake. As we pulled out of the campground, I looked back. She was standing at the ranger station, still, silent, staring at nothing. I thought about rolling down the window, saying something, asking her if she needed help, but I didn't. I couldn't. She never moved. As we rounded the bend and the trees swallowed her up, I remember feeling like we were leaving something behind we didn't understand. A warning, maybe. A secret that didn't want to be found. I don't know who she was. I don't know what happened to her. But I've never been back to Maple Hollow. And I never will. Some stories never leave you. They settle deep into your bones, into the shadowed parts of your memory, and they wait there. You grow up, move on, but every now and then, something, a smell, a sound, a place, pulls it all back like it never left. That's what happened to me a few years after the Maple Hollow incident. I was older then, college behind me, the strange night in the woods reduced to something I only talked about if someone brought up ghost stories around a fire. Landon and I never really spoke about it again, not seriously. But the memory was always there, just beneath the surface. That unease, that woman, that last look. So when my wife, Jenna, suggested a camping trip for our honeymoon, I hesitated. She had no idea what had happened to me before. I didn't want to scare her, didn't want to seem paranoid, and truthfully, part of me wanted to believe that Maple Hollow had been a fluke, a one-time thing, maybe even a trick of the mind. So I smiled, said it sounded perfect, and we packed our car for Fern Ridge National Park, just 5 hours north of our place in the Bay Area. It had just rained heavily in the region. A late spring storm swept through the redwoods the day before, knocking down branches and causing some localized flooding. But we checked the forecasts, read a few hiking blogs, and figured we'd be fine. If anything, it meant fewer tourists and more privacy. When we arrived, it was exactly that, quiet. The ranger station was nearly deserted. A tired-looking man in a green uniform handed us our permit and warned us to watch for slick trails. "You two might have the whole place to yourselves this week," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jenna beamed. I tried to ignore the knot forming in my gut. The road into the park narrowed into gravel after a few miles. Towering redwoods flanked either side, their thick trunks stretching impossibly high, branches lost in the canopy above. Sunlight struggled through, casting broken shadows that shifted like liquid across the road. It was beautiful, ethereal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Our campsite sat in a small clearing nestled between ancient trees. There was a metal fire ring, a wooden picnic table, and enough space to pitch our tent with a view of the woods in all directions. Jenna called it romantic. I agreed, though part of me felt like we were being swallowed by the forest itself. We set up camp, unloaded our cooler, and started exploring the area before nightfall. Fallen branches littered the ground. The forest floor was still damp. Everything smelled of pine and wet earth. A few hundred yards from our site, we stumbled across a cluster of old cabins. Gray, broken things with peeling paint and shattered windows. Creepy. Jenna said, peeking into one of them. I laughed it off, but I didn't like how quiet they were. It wasn't just abandonment. It was a kind of emptiness that made the skin on my arms prickle. We went back to camp before dark and struggled to start a fire. Everything around us was too wet to burn properly. Eventually, I resorted to using one of those store-bought fire logs and managed a weak flame. We roasted hot dogs, toasted marshmallows, and talked about our wedding. Jenna was radiant, her laugh echoing softly through the trees, and for a while I let myself believe we were just another happy couple out on an adventure. But the silence in that forest was unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was oppressive, like everything was holding its breath. When we climbed into the tent that night, Jenna cuddled close and said she couldn't believe how dark it was. She was right. The sky above the redwoods was pitch black. No moon, barely any stars. We fell asleep easily at first, exhausted from the drive and fresh air. But sometime after midnight she went rigid beside me. "Mark," she whispered, her lips brushing my ear. "Do you hear that?" I held my breath. At first nothing, then leaves. Crunching, soft and slow, as if someone, or something, was walking in a wide circle around our tent. "Probably a deer," I whispered, more for myself than for her. But I didn't believe it. Then came the murmurs, low, unintelligible, drifting through the air like static from an old radio. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound animal. It sounded wrong. The steps moved closer. Twigs snapped. The murmurs grew louder but never clear. Just noise. I reached for the flashlight, switched it off. We didn't want to draw attention. My heart pounded in my throat. Jenna gripped my arm, nails digging in. Then, right beside the tent, the fabric shifted. Something brushed against it. Gently. Like fingers. I couldn't breathe, and then it all stopped. Just silence. We lay there for what felt like hours, not speaking, not moving. Finally, I mouthed, "Let's go." We unzipped the tent slowly, praying it was empty outside. It was. The fire was long dead. The trees stood motionless in the dark. We made a run for the car. I tossed the cooler into the back seat and slammed the doors shut. "Stay here," I told her. "I'll get the tent." She didn't argue. I sprinted back across the clearing, pulling the stakes with shaking hands, yanking the entire tent, sleeping bags and all, into a tangled bundle. I didn't look into the woods. I didn't want to see what might be watching. We drove out fast, the tires slipping slightly on the wet gravel. We passed the broken cabins, the twisted trees, the empty trailheads. Somewhere in the dark, a single point of light flickered, like a flashlight, like someone standing deep in the forest, watching us leave. I didn't slow down. We didn't speak for the entire drive back. 5 hours. Silence. We pulled into Jenna's parents' driveway just as the sky turned gray with morning. We climbed out of the car and collapsed on their living room couch, still in our hiking clothes. I don't think we ever said the words out loud, not really. Not what we'd seen. Not what we'd heard. But the look in her eyes told me she remembered it just as clearly as I did. We've never gone camping again, and to this day, I can't explain what we experienced in those woods. But I know this, whatever it wasn't just the trees creaking or animals in the brush. It wasn't our imagination. Something moved through that forest that night, just beyond the veil of what we understand, and it knew we were there. Some people say fear fades with time, that once you're far enough removed from the moment, the sharp edges dull and the memory loses its grip. But that's never been true for me. Not after Maple Hollow, not after Fern Ridge. If anything, those experiences left behind a kind of echo, something that vibrated just beneath the surface of my everyday life. I told myself they were isolated events, strange but explainable, maybe a trick of the brain, the mind's way of processing the unexplainable. But deep down, I started to wonder if I was just drawing something to me. Some people attract trouble. Others attract tragedy. I wasn't sure what I attracted yet, but I was about to find out. A few years after our honeymoon, my life had gone off the rails. I lost my job at a mid-sized marketing firm after a series of layoffs. Jenna and I separated shortly after. No big blow-up, just a slow unraveling. I found myself living in my parents' basement at 32, waking up late, scrolling job boards and dodging questions about what I was going to do next. I felt like I was suffocating. So, in a burst of desperation disguised as self-care, I packed up my old SUV, loaded some gear, and drove south to North Carolina. I told my parents I was going camping for a few days to clear my head. I didn't mention that I had no job lined up, no interviews, no plan. I just needed quiet. Crooked Pine National Forest wasn't an official destination. It wasn't even listed in most travel blogs. I'd found it through an old online forum post, someone talking about how isolated and peaceful it was. No designated campsites, just patches of land you could claim for a night or two. That sounded perfect to me. I drove 5 hours in silence, no music, just the sound of the tires humming against the road. When I reached the outskirts of the forest, the sun was beginning to sink, casting long shadows across the gravel trail. I pulled off at a narrow turnoff near a creek, parked, hoisted my backpack, and walked 15 minutes through dense, green overgrowth until I found a clearing. It was small but perfect, flat ground, a decent view of the stream, and not a soul in sight. I pitched my tent under a wide canopy of sycamore and oak, the branches swaying gently in the early evening breeze. The forest was peaceful in a way that didn't quite settle me. It was too quiet. No bird calls, no distant rustling, just the endless sound of the creek bubbling along the rocks. I told myself I was just not used to the silence. That night I built a modest fire using some damp wood and fire starters. I cooked a can of beans and ate in silence, watching the flames flicker against the trunks of the trees. I should have felt relaxed. Instead, I felt like I was being watched. I shook it off, chalking it up to stress, and climbed into my tent, zipping the flap tightly. I lay awake for hours, eyes open in the dark, listening to the wind scrape through the branches. At some point, exhaustion took me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found a footprint. It was faint, half obscured by leaves, near the edge of the clearing. At first I thought it was mine, but when I compared the tread, it didn't match. I stared at it for a long time, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Maybe it was from a previous camper. Maybe someone had passed through without me hearing, or maybe someone had come by while I was asleep. That thought stayed with me all day. I went for a short hike up the ridge behind my site, hoping to spot a lookout or maybe distract myself with nature, but the trees seemed to close in around me. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being funneled, led. I turned back quickly and spent the afternoon near the creek, reading and trying to keep my mind from spiraling. That evening, I built a larger fire. The warmth helped. I made ramen and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the flashlight I'd brought was dimming. Another oversight. I'd have to change the batteries tomorrow. When I climbed into my tent that night, I checked the zippers twice. Sleep came quicker than the night before, but around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of leaves crunching. Slow, deliberate, footsteps. My eyes flew open, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I listened. Whatever it was close, walking in a circle around my tent. My hand slowly reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I was afraid of what I'd see. Then came a flicker. A narrow, quick beam of light, like someone scanning the clearing with a headlamp. It swept past the tent, vanished, then reappeared on the other side. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. I held perfectly still, praying it would stop. It didn't. The footsteps continued, soft but purposeful. They stopped near my car. Silence. Then they retreated, slowly. No talking, no animals, just presence. I didn't sleep after that. I lay in the dark, counting seconds, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. At first light, I burst from the tent and scanned the clearing. No one. Nothing. But near my car, on the passenger side, I saw scuff marks in the dirt, dragged leaves, like someone had stood there for a while, watching. I packed fast, tossed everything into the SUV without care for organization. Before I left, I walked to the edge of the trees where the scuff marks led. They disappeared into the brush, No trail, no footprints past a few feet, just forest. I stared into those woods, the green swallowed by shadow, and felt that familiar sense of being unwelcome. I drove out fast, faster than I should have on gravel, not stopping until I hit pavement. Only when I reached the nearest town did I breathe again. I never reported what happened. Who would I tell? What would I say? There were no crimes, no injuries, just fear. Just the knowledge that something, or someone, was in that forest with me, watching, waiting. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even go hiking, and some nights, when I lie awake and the house is quiet, I hear it again. That faint sound of footsteps in the leaves. And I wonder if I was ever really alone out there. Or if I brought something back with me, something that hasn't finished watching. Some stories don't leave scars on the skin, but they carve themselves deep into memory. After everything I experienced in Maple Hollow, Fern Ridge, and Crooked Pine, I've come to believe that not all dangers in the wild come with claws or teeth. Some of them whisper, some of them crawl, some of them stand just outside the light, watching. The woods are beautiful, yes. They're peaceful, vast, humbling, but they are also ancient and unknowable, and in their deepest corners, you may not always be alone. If there's a lesson to take from these 3 stories, it's this. Never ignore your instincts. When your gut tells you something is wrong, don't rationalize it away. Don't convince yourself you're just being silly or overreacting. Whether it's a whisper in the dark or a footprint that shouldn't be there, trust that inner voice. Fear is not weakness, it's a survival mechanism. Respect it. Second, don't overestimate your control just because you're carrying a flashlight or a GPS. Nature doesn't bend to our technology or our sense of safety. No matter how familiar the trail, no matter how tame the campground seems, always be alert. Don't wander too far from others, and if you're with someone, especially kids or a partner, don't shrug off their fear. Listen, respond, leave if you have to. And lastly, some encounters don't need an explanation. We live in a world full of mysteries, and not all of them are meant to be solved. The woman in the woods, the footsteps at night, the eyes you feel on your back. They may not have a name, but they have weight. They leave an impression, and if nothing else, they remind us that our world is much stranger than we care to admit. Thank you for listening to these stories. If you stayed with me through all 3, I hope they not only gave you chills, but also a reason to look twice at the forest edge next time you're out there. On behalf of Enigma of the Unknown, I want to sincerely thank you for spending your time here. Every view, every listen, every subscriber helps us keep sharing these unsettling truths and eerie tales from the shadows. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap that bell icon so you won't miss the next dark chapter we uncover. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and when you hear something strange in the night, don't always assume it's just the wind. We'll see you next time, if you make it back.